Okay, so you flagged some really significant news for us, these recent trade tariff announcements. It's, well, it's the kind of thing that can leave your head spinning a bit.
Definitely. Lots of numbers, lots of jargon.
Yeah, makes you feel like you need a PhD just to follow along, let alone to figure out what it all means. So for this deep dive, we're going to try and cut through that noise. We'll use that My Pension Advisor article you sent over and just figure out the key takeaways.
Exactly. The mission is simple. Get a clear picture. What are these tariffs really? What kicked them off? And crucially, what's the potential fallout going to be? Without getting bogged down.
Right, a shortcut to understanding the real implications. So let's dive in. This whole thing kicked off with what they're calling the Liberation Day announcement,
Dramatic name.
isn't it? And the timing itself seems pretty calculated after the U.S. stock market closed on Wednesday, April 2nd. The article also mentioned a, shall we say, unique presentation style.
Hey, yeah, it did. Described it almost like a game show host,
Hmm,
which is, well, an interesting choice for rolling out major economic policy.
a bit unusual.
But what's really key here is the legal basis they're citing. The USA International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977. That framing suggests they see this as a response to some kind of major national emergency.
Okay, so it's framed as an emergency measure, and it's happening fast.
Very fast. Target date for implementation is April 9th, so things are moving quickly.
Right, okay. So we have the when and the dramatic why. Let's get into the specifics. The article mentions reciprocal tariffs. Sounds fair, right?
Mm.
But there are questions about how they're actually calculating these.
Yeah, reciprocal sounds like a simple tit for tat. You tax our goods X%, we tax yours X%. But the article points out something really critical and honestly pretty controversial.
Which is?
The inclusion of value-added tax, VAT, in how they're calculating these supposed notional rates of other countries. Now, VAT is basically a consumption tax, right? It's added along the way.
Right, like sales tax here almost.
Sort of, but applied differently. Anyway, the point is, VAT isn't generally considered a direct border tariff, like a customs duty. So by throwing VAT into the calculation, it makes other countries' trade barriers look artificially higher.
Ah, I see. So it kind of boosts the number they're trying to match.
Exactly. It could be seen as a way to justify much higher U.S. tariffs under this reciprocity idea, even if the other country's actual tariffs aren't that high. It's definitely a departure from standard trade economics.
That's a really important distinction. Okay, so it's not straightforward matching. And the article also said that the old tariffs are sticking around. Steel, aluminum, cars.
Yep, those aren't going anywhere. They remain in effect. So this is layered on top. What's new is this baseline, this minimum global tariff rate of 10%.
A global minimum of 10%. Are there any exceptions?
They mentioned a few potential ones: energy, copper, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, and lumber. But the article stressed these exemptions might be limited, maybe even temporary, so a lot of uncertainty there.
Okay, let's break down the impact region by region.
Yeah.
What about the UK? The article hinted it might be less bad for them, despite the car tariffs.
It's complicated for the UK. On one hand, a 10% minimum might seem better than, say, the existing 25% tariff on cars, which is a huge UK export to the US.
Right.
But, and this is big but, the article immediately flags concerns from the UK's own Office for Budget Responsibility. They're worried. Worried about the UK government's budget, potential inflation increases, unemployment. Basically, the ripple effects from these global US tariffs and the likely retaliation from other countries.
So even if the direct number looks okay in one area, the bigger picture is still messy.
Precisely. It highlights how interconnected everything is.
And speaking of interconnectedness, what about the EU? Big trading partner for everyone. They're facing a 20% tariff now.
Yeah, 20% for the EU. That's significant.
Yeah.
It could definitely strain US-EU trade relations. And as the article notes, it could have knock-on effects for the UK's already complex post-Brexit relationship with the EU, and even potentially the situation in Northern Ireland.
Wow. Yeah, trade policy is never simple, is it?
Rarely just about the tariffs themselves.
Okay, let's turn to China. The numbers here are stark. A new 34% tariff plus the two existing 10% ones. So 54% total.
54%, yeah, it's a massive figure. And the immediate impact, as the article highlights, is on companies heavily reliant on manufacturing in China for the U.S. market.
Like Apple.
Apple is the textbook example. Think iPhones. The market reaction speaks volumes that reported 7% drop in Apple's share price right after the announcement. That shows you the perceived financial risk. It just got a lot more expensive to bring those goods into the U.S.
Makes you wonder what companies like that do now and what it means for the price of the next iPhone.
Absolutely. Big strategic questions for them.
And what about this China plus one idea? Companies trying to move production out of China to places like Vietnam or Thailand. Sounds like these tariffs might mess that up too.
That was one of the real surprises in the article, actually. The rates for those potential alternative countries are unexpectedly high. Vietnam at 46%, Cambodia 48%, Thailand 36%, Indonesia 32%.
Whoa! So much for that escape route.
It really suggests that simply shifting production next door might not offer the tariff advantage companies were hoping for. It looks like a much broader attempt to reshape supply chains, not just move them slightly.
Okay, so the scope is wide. What about the overall economic impact here in the U.S.? The article mentioned a huge jump in the effective tariff rate.
Yeah, the estimate is a jump from just over 2% average effective rate on imports in 2024 to potentially around 25%. That's huge.
25% average. That's enormous.
It is. The article also mentions projected revenue like $600 billion, but critically it points out that number relies on a pretty dubious assumption, as they put it, that trade patterns won't change, which, history tells us is unlikely. When imports get drastically more expensive, people and businesses adapt. They buy domestic, they find other sources, or they just buy less.
So that $600 billion might be optimistic. And who actually pays these tariffs? The article seemed pretty clear it's not foreign countries writing checks.
Exactly. That's a common misconception. While the tariff is levied at the border on the imported good, the economic burden, well, it usually gets passed down the chain, unless importers decide to slash their profit margins significantly.
Which seems unlikely across the board.
Right. So ultimately, it's U.S. consumers who tend to bear the brunt through higher prices on potentially a whole range of imported goods.
So despite claims otherwise, it's households here feeling it in our wallets.
That's the standard economic expectation, yes.
And that leads directly to inflation, right?
Mm-hmm.
The article predicted a one-off boost of maybe 2%. It also mentioned, kind of oddly, Trump's comments about egg prices falling.
Yeah, that was a slightly strange juxtaposition. I mean, egg prices fluctuate for specific reasons like bird flu outbreaks and recovery, That's different from a broad-based increase in import costs across the board.
So it's not really comparable.
Not really. A widespread tariff increase is much more likely to put general upward pressure on overall inflation. The article makes a good point, comparing it to the COVID supply chain disruptions. We saw how those broader cost increases fed through to consumer prices.
And it also mentioned the risk of second-round effects,
Yeah.
like workers demanding higher wages because everything costs more.
Precisely. That's the potential inflationary spiral. Tariffs push up costs, consumers face higher prices, workers then need higher wages to cope, which increases business costs further, potentially leading back to more price increases. It's a cycle.
A tricky cycle to break.
Very much so.
Which brings us finally to the Federal Reserve. They have a meeting coming up end of the first week of May, I think. They must be looking at a very different picture now.
Oh, absolutely. They're in a tough spot. Their job is balancing price stability, controlling inflation with maximum employment. These tariffs throw major uncertainty into both sides of that equation. Well, they have to weigh the potential inflationary impact of the tariffs against the risk that these same tariffs could slow down the economy, hurt businesses, maybe even tip things towards recession and higher unemployment.
Damned if they do, damned if they don't, almost.
It's a very, very delicate balancing act. Plus, they have to factor in the possibility that these policies could be reversed or negotiated down, or that other countries retaliate strongly. All of that makes setting interest rate policy extremely challenging right now.
Okay, so pulling this all together from our deep dives into that article, these new tariffs are a really big deal, a significant shift in U.S. trade policy.
Definitely a major shift.
With potentially broad impacts. Higher prices for U.S. consumers, big challenges for businesses navigating costs and supply chains, and ripples across the whole global economy, changing trade flows, potential retaliation. The different rates for different countries really hit home how linked everything is.
Exactly. And it's worth remembering, these things often have consequences beyond just the economic numbers. Geopolitics plays a huge role, too. How countries react, how relationships shift. It's all connected.
Which leads us to a final thought, maybe something for listeners to mull over. We're facing this potential double whammy, right? Higher inflation and a possible economic slowdown because of these tariffs. So the question becomes, what kinds of strategies should businesses or even individuals start thinking about to navigate this uncertain landscape? Definitely something worth keeping a close eye on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.